I did not visit my grandfather very often. I always told myself I was busy, work was busy, life was busy. There was always something to do. Sometimes my mother asked, "Did you call Grandpa this week?" I always gave the same answer. "I will call him tomorrow." But tomorrow often became next week. My grandfather lived in a small house near the edge of our town. The house was old, but it was warm and quiet. A tall tree stood at the yard. When I was a child, I loved that tree. I used to climb it and pretend I was an explorer in a jungle. My grandfather always watched me from his wooden chair. He never stopped me. He only smiled. One Sunday afternoon, my mother called me again. "You should visit your grandfather," she said. Her voice sounded serious. "He misses you." I looked at the clock on my wall. It was only 2 in the afternoon. For once I had no meetings, no plans, and no excuses. So I got into my car and started to drive. The road to my grandfather's house was the same road I knew from my childhood. But something felt different that day. The town looked quieter. The houses looked older. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. When I arrived, the gate was half open. The small yard looked just like before. The tall tree still stood there. Its leaves moved slowly in the wind. My grandfather sat under the tree in his old wooden chair. He wore a grey sweater and a small brown hat. His hands rested on a walking cane. For a moment, I just stood there and watched him. He looked smaller than I remembered. Then he saw me. His eyes became bright, and a warm smile appeared on his face. "Well," he said softly, "look who is here." I walked toward him. "Hi, Grandpa," I said. He laughed a little. "You are late again," he said. I smiled, but I felt a small pain in my chest. "I know," I said. "Work is busy." Grandfather nodded slowly. "Work is always busy," he said. He pointed to the empty chair beside him. "Sit down. The afternoon is still young." I sat next to him. The chair made a quiet creaking sound. For a while we did not talk. We only listened to the wind in the tree and the distant sound of birds. Then my grandfather stood up slowly. "Wait here," he said. He walked into the house. His steps were careful and slow. A few minutes later, he came back with 2 cups of tea. He handed one to me. "Careful," he said. "It is hot." The tea smelled sweet and warm. I remembered that smell from my childhood. We sipped the tea quietly. After some time he asked, "How is your work?" "It is good," I said, "but very busy." He nodded again. "Busy can be good," he said, "but busy can also make people forget things." I looked at him. "What things?" I asked. He looked at the tall tree for a long moment. Then he smiled gently. "Simple things," he said. "The wind, a cup of tea, a quiet afternoon." I did not know what to say, so I just drank my tea. The sun slowly moved across the sky. The shadows of the tree grew longer on the ground. Then my grandfather turned to me again. His eyes were calm, but very serious. "I am glad you came today," he said. "Me too," I answered. He leaned back in his chair and took a slow breath. Then he said something that surprised me. "Today," he said quietly, "I want to teach you one last lesson." I blinked. "One last lesson?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes." I laughed a little. "Grandpa, you sound like a teacher." He smiled. "Maybe I am," he said. The wind moved through the leaves above us. The tree made a soft whispering sound. I looked at my grandfather. For the first time that day, I noticed how thin his hands looked. And suddenly, a strange feeling entered my heart. I did not know why, but I felt that this afternoon was different. Very different. After my grandfather said those words, the yard became very quiet. The last lesson. The sentence stayed in my mind. I looked at him and laughed a little, but inside I felt uneasy. "Grandpa," I said. "Why do you say it like that?" He did not answer my question right away. Instead, he slowly stood up from his chair. His hands rested on his cane. His movements were careful, but calm. "Come," he said, "let us take a walk." "A walk?" I asked. "Yes," he said with a gentle smile. "A small walk." I looked at his thin legs. He did not look very strong. "Are you sure?" I asked. He nodded. "If I walk slowly, the road will wait for me." I could not help smiling at his words. So I stood up and followed him. We left the yard and walked toward the small road in front of his house. The afternoon sun was soft and warm. A light wind moved through the trees. My grandfather walked very slowly, step by step. Sometimes he stopped for a moment. Then he continued. I stayed close beside him. When I was a child, this road felt very long. I used to run along it with my friends. We laughed, shouted, and chased each other. But now the road felt smaller and quieter. After a few minutes, my grandfather pointed to a large tree near the road. "Do you remember this tree?" he asked. I looked at it. The tree was tall and wide. Its branches stretched across the sky. Suddenly I smiled. "Yes," I said, "I fell from that tree once." My grandfather laughed. "You did," he said. "You cried very loudly." "I was 8 years old," I said. "And your grandmother ran outside very fast," he added. He laughed again, and his eyes became bright with memory. Then we walked a little farther. Soon we reached a small wooden bridge over a narrow stream. The water moved quietly under the bridge. My grandfather stopped again. "This bridge," he said slowly, "was not here before." "Really?" I asked. He nodded. "Many years ago, people crossed the water with stones." He pointed to the stream. "One winter, the water became very strong. The stones moved away. So the town built this bridge." I looked at the old wood under our feet. "Sometimes life is like that," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked at the flowing water. "Sometimes the road changes," he said, "and people must build a new bridge." We stood there for a moment. The sound of water filled the quiet afternoon. Then we continued our slow walk. Soon we passed a small shop at the corner of the road. The window was full of bread and cakes. I suddenly laughed. "Oh no," I said. "What?" my grandfather asked. "This bakery," I said. "I remember this place." He smiled. "Yes," he said, "you loved the sweet bread." "I still do," I admitted. "When you were 10, he said, "you tried to buy bread with buttons." I stared at him. "I did not." "You did," he said proudly. "You put 3 buttons on the counter and said, 'This is money.'" I could not stop laughing. "That is very embarrassing," I said. My grandfather laughed too. His laugh was soft, but full of joy. Then he said something quietly. "You see?" "What?" I asked. He looked at the bakery, the road, and the trees around us. "These places hold our stories." I looked around slowly. For the first time in many years, I noticed every small thing. The smell of fresh bread, the warm light on the road, the gentle wind on my face. We continued walking until we reached a small open field. The grass moved slowly in the wind. In the center of the field stood a large old tree. My grandfather stopped there. He looked a little tired. "Let us sit here," he said. We walked to the tree and sat down on the soft grass. The sun was lower now, and the sky had turned a warm golden color. For a while, my grandfather said nothing. He only looked at the sky. Then he slowly reached into the pocket of his coat. He took out something small. It was an old watch. The metal looked worn, but the glass still shone in the sunlight. He held it gently in his hand. Then he looked at me. "I have carried this watch for 40 years, he said. I leaned closer. The watch ticked softly. Tick, tick, tick. My grandfather placed the watch in my hand. I felt the cool metal against my skin. "Grandpa," I said in surprise, "this is yours." He nodded. "Yes." "But why are you giving it to me?" He looked at me quietly. Then he said something I would never forget. "Because time is the most important gift we have." I looked down at the watch in my hand. It was heavier than I expected. The metal was old, but it still felt strong. The small hands moved slowly under the glass. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was very soft, but I could hear it clearly in the quiet field. "Grandpa," I said, "I cannot take this." He looked at me with calm eyes. "Why not?" he asked. "Because it is yours," I said. "You said you carried it for 40 years. He smiled gently. "Yes," he said, "for 40 years." He looked at the watch for a moment. His eyes were full of memory. "Your grandmother gave this watch to me," he said. I looked up. "Really?" I asked. He nodded. "It was a birthday gift," he said. "I was young then. I worked at the train station." I tried to imagine him as a young man. It was hard. To me, he had always been my grandfather. "What did you do at the train station?" I asked. "I sold tickets," he said with a small laugh. "Every day people came and left. I watched many trains go far away." He paused and looked at the open field. "Your grandmother told me something when she gave me this watch." "What did she say?" I asked. He leaned back against the tree. "She said, 'Do not let work take all your time.'" I waited for him to continue. "She said time is like water in your hands," he added slowly. "If you hold it too tight, it will still run away." The wind moved softly through the leaves above us. For a moment we both listened to the sound. Then I looked again at the watch. "Did you follow her advice?" I asked. My grandfather smiled, but this time the smile was quiet. "Not always," he said honestly. "When I was young, I worked too much." He looked at his hands. "I wanted to earn money. I wanted to build a good life." "That sounds normal," I said. "Yes," he replied, "but sometimes I came home very late." He looked at me again. "Your mother was small then. She waited for me many nights." I felt a small sadness in my chest. "I think many people live like that now," I said. He nodded. "Yes, people run very fast." He pointed toward the town behind us. "Cars move fast. Phones ring all day. Work never sleeps." Then he looked directly at me. "But life is not supposed to feel like a race." His words were simple, but they felt heavy. I thought about my own life, my long work hours, my full calendar, my many excuses. Suddenly the quiet field felt very honest. "Grandpa," I asked softly, "is this the lesson?" He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "not yet." He gently pushed the watch closer to me. "Open it," he said. I looked at him in surprise. "The watch opens?" I asked. "Yes," he said. I turned the small watch in my fingers. On the side I saw a tiny button. I pressed it carefully. Click. The cover opened. Inside the lid, there were small words carved into the metal. The letters were old, but clear. I read them slowly. "Give your time to the people you love." I looked up at him. "You wrote this?" I asked. He shook his head. "No," he said. "Your grandmother wrote it." I touched the small letters with my finger. The metal felt smooth from many years. "After she died," he said quietly, "I read these words many times." His voice was calm, but I could feel the deep feeling behind it. "She was always right," he added with a soft smile. The sun moved lower in the sky. The light around us became warm and golden. "Grandpa," I said slowly, "are you giving this watch to me because of that message?" He nodded. "Yes." "But I still do not understand," I said. He looked at me with kind eyes. Then he said the words that would stay in my heart forever. Time is not something you keep. He gently closed my hand around the watch. Time is something you give. The watch ticked quietly in my palm. Tick, tick, tick. I suddenly felt the weight of those simple words. And for the first time, I truly listened to the sound of time. For a long time, we sat quietly under the tree. The wind moved through the grass. The sun slowly dropped toward the hills. The light turned soft and golden. I still held the watch in my hand. Tick, tick, tick. The sound felt louder now. I looked at my grandfather. He sat against the tree with his eyes half closed. His face looked peaceful, but also very tired. "Grandpa," I said softly, "are you okay?" He opened his eyes and smiled. "Yes," he said, "I am just an old man who walked too far today." I smiled a little. "It was not very far," I said. "For you, maybe," he replied. We both laughed quietly. After a moment, he pushed his hands against the ground and slowly stood up. "Come," he said, "the evening is coming." I stood up quickly and helped him. His arm felt thin but steady. We started walking back toward the town. The road looked different now. The golden sunlight stretched long shadows across the ground. The air felt cooler. My grandfather walked even slower than before. Step, step, step. Sometimes he stopped and looked around, at the trees, at the sky, at the small houses along the road. I realized something then. He was not just walking home. He was looking at everything, as if he wanted to remember it all. When we passed the bakery again, the warm smell of fresh bread filled the air. "Ah," my grandfather said with a smile, "that smell is dangerous." "Dangerous?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "It makes old men spend money." I laughed. "Do you want some bread?" He thought for a moment. Then he shook his head gently. "No," he said. "The smell is enough." We continued walking. Soon we reached the small wooden bridge again. The stream below it moved quietly in the fading light. My grandfather rested his hands on the railing. He watched the water for a moment. "Water never stops," he said. "No," I replied, "but people do." His words were simple, but they made my chest feel tight. We stood there silently for a few seconds. Then he straightened his back and said, "Let us go home." When we finally reached his house, the sky had turned orange and pink. The tall tree in the yard moved slowly in the evening wind. Inside the house, everything looked the same as always. The small wooden table, the old clock on the wall, the pictures of our family. My grandfather moved slowly into the kitchen. "Sit," he told me. "I will make a simple dinner." "You should rest," I said quickly. "I can cook." He shook his head. "No," he said with a small smile. "Tonight, I cook." So I sat at the table and watched him. He moved slowly, but his hands knew every step. Soon the kitchen filled with the warm smell of soup and rice. We ate together at the small table. The food was simple, but it tasted wonderful. "Grandpa," I said, "this soup is perfect." He looked pleased. "Good," he said. "Then my last cooking lesson is also successful." I smiled, but the word last made my heart feel heavy again. After dinner we sat quietly for a while. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily. Tick, tick, tick. My grandfather looked at me with calm eyes. "I am happy today," he said. "Why?" I asked. "Because you came back," he answered. His voice was soft but full of feeling. I looked down at the watch in my hand. "I should come more often," I said. He gently shook his head. "No," he said. "Do not come because of guilt. Come because of love." His words stayed in the quiet room. Then he reached across the table and held my hand. His hand felt warm but fragile. "You are a good person," he said. "Just remember the lesson." "I will," I promised. Outside, the night slowly covered the sky. A few stars appeared above the tall tree. My grandfather stood up slowly. "I think I will sleep early tonight," he said. That walk was a big adventure for me. I walked with him to his bedroom door. "Good night, Grandpa," I said. "Good night," he replied. Then he added softly, "Thank you for today." I watched him close the door. The house became very quiet. I sat alone in the living room for a long time. The old wall clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. I held the watch in my hand and listened to its small sound. For the first time in many years, I did not look at my phone. I did not think about work. I only listened to time. The next morning, my phone rang very early. It was my mother. Her voice was quiet. "Are you sitting down?" she asked. My heart suddenly felt cold. "Yes," I said slowly. There was a long silence on the line. Then she said the words I was not ready to hear. "Your grandfather passed away last night." For a moment, I could not speak. My mother's words stayed in the air like a heavy cloud. "Your grandfather passed away last night." I sat very still in the quiet living room. The old clock on the wall kept moving. Tick, tick, tick. It was the same sound I heard the night before, but now it felt different. My mother spoke softly on the phone. "The doctor said he went peacefully," she said. "He fell asleep and did not wake up." I closed my eyes. Part of me already knew. Last night felt special. Too special. As if my grandfather knew something I did not. The morning light entered through the window. It fell gently on the table, the chairs, and the old clock. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt the same. I slowly stood up and walked through the house. The kitchen still smelled faintly like last night's soup. 2 bowls were still in the sink. Our bowls. I touched the edge of the table where we had eaten dinner together. I could almost hear his voice again. "Tonight I cook." My chest felt tight, but my grandfather did not like sadness that lasted too long. He always said life should move like a river. So I took a deep breath and walked toward his bedroom. The door was slightly open. Inside, the room looked calm and peaceful. Sunlight rested on the bed. My grandfather lay there quietly. His face looked relaxed, almost as if he was still sleeping. For a moment, I simply stood there. Then I whispered, "Good morning, Grandpa." My voice sounded small in the quiet room. I stepped closer and sat on the chair beside his bed. "Thank you for yesterday," I said softly. The room did not answer, but somehow I felt that he had already heard me. After a while, I walked back to the living room. The watch was still in my hand. I had held it the whole time. I opened it again. Click. Inside the lid, the small words shone in the morning light. "Give your time to the people you love." I read the sentence slowly. This time the words felt deeper. Yesterday they were a lesson. Today they were a promise. I closed the watch and held it against my chest. My grandfather's voice returned in my memory. "Time is not something you keep. Time is something you give." Before that day, I thought time was something I could control. I filled my calendar with meetings. I filled my phone with reminders. I told people, maybe next week. But my grandfather showed me something simple. Next week is not always there. Later is not always real. Sometimes the most important moment is just a quiet afternoon under a tree. Later that day, my mother arrived. We sat together in the yard under the tall tree. The wind moved softly through the leaves. "This was his favorite place," she said. "I know," I replied. I told her about our walk, the tree, the bridge, the bakery, and the watch. When I finished, she smiled gently. "That sounds like your father," she said. He always believed small moments were the most important. I looked up at the tall branches above us. Sunlight moved between the leaves like golden water. From that day on, I started to change small things in my life. Not big changes, just small ones. I called my mother more often. I visited friends instead of sending short messages. Sometimes I left work a little earlier. Sometimes I sat quietly with a cup of tea, just like my grandfather. And every time I hear the soft sound of the watch, tick, 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 I remember his last lesson. My grandfather gave me many things in my life, stories, kindness, memories. But his last gift was the most important. He gave me the understanding of time. And now, every day, I try to give that gift to others, just like he did.